Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. It's my second time in India. I have a great love of India. I'm also here to develop cultural dialogue. I'm very much an internationalist. There's one world. It's very small, and I keep bumping into colleagues, friends and associates. And my primary work is to work with the autistic condition, challenge and opportunity. And I have no history of working with autism. That's quite interesting, being in this remarkable audience of people who have connectivity, children, friends. I found myself, as a potter, being invited to work with some autistic youth. And little did I know that that was going to change my life. My first entry into the classroom was greeted with silence. And I thought, gosh, having trained as a teacher and been interested in exclusion, how would I actually ask this group of young people to make a pot? And little did I know that all I had to do was to move correctly, gently, and skillfully. And they all followed. And they, within a few months, were able to center clay on the wheel. And what I discovered is that they became my teachers. Now that's quite a reversal for a guy who's been through a degree course, an arts course, trained in history of art, trained in ceramics, and then did a teacher's training. And you're told through the inductive process that you teach. And what I discovered is that they started to teach me. In fact, what they taught me was that what the clay did to me was much greater than anything I could do to the clay. There was a complete reversal. And what they taught me in this silence and this skill of observing me, because they're very visually interested in the world, but they aren't always interested, and they weren't when I first started, actually necessarily being part of the world. They were observers of the world. They were observers of me. And what they were telling me was that if you walk, Aonghous, if you move in the right way, we'll trust you. And I thought, but what are they trusting? I think they were trusting me in the sense that I was going to create something in which I wasn't necessarily present, but the interests of the other were present. That's called craft work. A craftsman makes things on behalf of other human beings, not for himself. So this identity issue of the potter, the artist, or the boundary between the egotist and the artist and the craftsperson had been sublimated, been put into check by the fact that I was making and moving according to a law, a social law, called making a vase, making a teapot. That became very interesting for me. And in a way, I became an action researcher, not only on myself, but in connection with myself and those young autistic adolescent boys and girls. So I opened up a dialogue, and I've ended up creating 12 centers, schools and colleges and social enterprise centers across England, Wales, and Scotland. So, you can see in this picture, on the left, this young man who came into the college. He's 16 years of age, and he was rigid. He didn't enjoy moving. He'd been sitting at home. He'd been excluded from school. And within 3 months, he was blowing glass vases. He was able to move with articulation. He was able to exhale his breath. And I discovered that it was craft work that brought those interesting young youth who had a label into the world of work and engagement. And all this could be done in quite a degree of silence, because it wasn't an instructive process, it was a perceptual process. They had to watch the role modelers of the master glassmakers, the master potters. And if the master glassmakers and the master potters are skillful in their role modeling, they talk less and do more. And those young people rather enjoyed the presence. I call it to be in the slipstream of the master. And the more I went into this, the more I discovered that actually to engage those young people who had that label, I had to get them to step out of one world and into a new world. It's called being in community. But what are the steps that are actually logistical and logical and repeatable to move them from where they are into this world of being in the world? And I want to talk a little bit about that. Oops, sorry. Oh dear. Sorry, good. Right, so Ruskin Mill works right across England and Wales. And it's a developmental organization. I'm the entrepreneur, and I have an incredible team of people with me. And one of my colleagues, Sophia Rasmussen, is here today. I asked her to come along because I want her to talk about the outstanding training in the curriculum for the care staff. Training care staff in the UK is one of the most challenging things you can do right now. And Sophia's training in being able to offer the residential offer for our young students has now been repeated twice across the UK in receiving outstanding from Ofsted, which is a tricky status to be able to arrive at. Yeah, so it takes a lot of hard work. So thank you, Sophia, for coming all the way to actually be part of this process. So Ruskin Mill is a good provider by Ofsted for education and receives 2 outstandings in relationship to care. You'll also see that we work internationally. I have a master's program, which is free in the UK, funded by Norwegian government, to undertake a master's in special needs education. 30% of the content is the Ruskin Mill method. Also work in the US, work in China and Nanjing particularly, where we're looking to work with Nanjing University in training special needs teachers in the Ruskin Mill method. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the Ruskin Mill method is. And we're also quite interested in working in Malaysia right now with the Malaysian government that's looking to reimagine the resources for Asperger's and autism. So this is our model. It's complicated. It's a holistic, transdisciplinary approach. And it comes out of the work of Rudolf Steiner and Irte Wegmann, who was one of her colleagues. And that's at a checkered press in England at the moment. But Ruskin Mill is doing quite well in that respect, partly because we research all of the assumptions as we have to, whatever method or whatever clinical operation we use as an intervention. Without the organization researching the practice on the ground on a daily level, we'll get into opinions and assumptions. And do you know what? I've discovered that that is where most staff stress takes place, where we start arguing with each other about what it is. No, let's go and actually do a research project. So 7 years ago, I started a research project and found that the power and intention of the staff was overwhelming. And we've now got 5 PhDs that are sponsored by the organization, all researching aspects of autism and the trusts practice. You might see that there is a circle on the outer periphery. And that's one of Rudolf Steiner's probably most ingenious indications about how to work in education per se, never mind special needs. And that is that these 12 intelligences that he calls the senses are a lens by which we look at an intervention with our children and young people. That's another lecture. That's another talk. But key to being successful in England is that every child has to have an education, care, and health plan. And without that, you don't get any funding. So in developing care and education health plans, which are then funded by the local government and the national government, we haven't had too much problem in actually expanding our provision, provided you get the outcomes. So our business model is very simple. If you deliver what you say you're going to do, and actually it's even better than what you say you're going to do, then you get repeat business. And in a certain sense, the judges of that are the pupils, students, and the parents themselves. So we have a 3-stage process. The first stage is to find out what the barriers of learning are. And we had a very good presentation from the center in New York, the Discovery Center. And I thought the way you presented that was excellent, because if you can actually attend to those 6 qualities, then you're actually de-escalating the barriers. Now, one of the things that we then do is to go straight into skill work. And we immerse children and young people in the world of skills, to the point where even Ofsted gets a little bit twitchy when I say, no, we only do 50% of our learning and teaching in the classroom. In our colleges, it's 70% outside. So in a way, we've disestablished the classroom as an environment to deliver learning. And we've had to be very meticulous in gathering the data that young people are learning. Because the assumption is that unless you're in a classroom, the kids aren't learning. And Ofsted would say to me when they came to inspect the provision, Mr. Gordon, do we still have to bring our Wellington boots? As if, have you grown up yet? And I would say, yes, and your umbrellas this year. You remember what happened 4 years ago? It was a washout. So you do have to stand your ground. And so this disestablishment of the formal spaces for learning is one of the things that Ruskin has done. And it's been risky at times, but incredibly rewarding for the pupils. Because although we don't do a high level of maths and English, our maths and English capacity and profile of achievement in our pupils spikes when we take them outside. That's another talk, but it's really interesting data. And so becoming skillful, in a way, can be said, I become mathematical. I become cohesive. My bodily coordination, my mentalization, my hands and my body cohere in purpose and attention. And that's the prized expectation of teachers. Can we generate attention? And then can we generate the motivation from within to generate even more attention and participation and engagement? And now we're talking about young people who have a certain suspicion of going out into the world. And then contributing to community. That's the prized possession. No child or pupil or young person leaves the Ruskin Mill Centre without a transition plan that's in place, that's going to work, that goes on either into a further education college or university or a new residential home or back home where they can actually take up a job. One of our great achievements is when we can actually reconnect the young people into the family homes successfully. where often it's broken down and therefore they need a residential placement. So our profile of young people is very broad, from some of the highest capable young people to some of young people who actually have complete speech impediment. So, what are we doing when we make a pot? So I've gone back in history, and as I mentioned, I'm a bit of an art historian. And I've looked at some Egyptian mythological ideas about how does a human being come into the world? Well, the god Khnum in the ancient Egyptian mythology here is acting as a pincer. Can you see his arms are a pincer? And he's holding his hands on the head and the hands of Hector. And the axis of the pincer is in the heart. You might say there's a trichotomy here. What Khnum is saying is, for a human being to come into the world, you have to activate head, heart, and hands. And this idea of the trichotomy, this threefoldness in human developmental integration, was clearly understood by the Egyptians. It was also understood by the Greeks. It was forgotten by the Romans. It was then re-understood in early Aristotelian literature, later on in Europe, and then it was forgotten about during the Enlightenment. So what Rudolf Steiner's done is to reactivate this trichotomy, this primary sense of reimagining how you activate head, heart, and hands. Now, my research tells me that craft work tends to activate that. And it may be one of the reasons why, and I cannot stand here and tell you that is why, it may be one of the reasons why we get such remarkable accelerated outcomes when students, particularly at 16, come into our education and training centers. So I've gone a bit deeper. Rudolf Steiner himself actually described that the challenges of coming into this world are actually have to be undertaken with a high level of effort and a high level of parental or support. So what he's shown here is that that dotted line represents 2 dimensions. Now, when I work with young people on the spectrum, I find that they're very capable of being in 2 dimensions. And they're also very capable of imagining, but not participating in the 3-dimensional element. So what he says is that you have to encourage children to come into the depth perspective. They've got to step out of themselves and into the world. And that dimension of going into depth is activated when they are motoric, practically engaged. The next thing that is required is the relationships. In this ability to be able to embrace the world, you have to go into what might be called the horizontal dimension, the relationship dimension. And to activate those 2 dimensions, you need to be able to step and be in the world as an active agent. So this process of coming into the world is, in a way, catalyzed by being practically involved in the garden. That's what Ofsted didn't quite understand. Practically involved in craft work. And then I want to say a little bit about why craft work in particular is an agent of self-soothing for the autistic tendency to actually be led into the world with joy and delight to learn. So this is quite specific. So my request to every pupil is step into focus. How do we do it? Well, you've got to go into the frontal plane. That's the depth plane. Then you've got to grasp your hands, and you've got to do something with it. And then you've got to actually focus. So you go from gaze to focus. Now, if we watch some of those very, very interesting clips, we could see very often, particularly that young guy from Kuwait, where we saw that tremendous transformation. What happened there, from my perspective, is that he went from the gaze perspective, the gaze situation, into the focus perspective, and then into attention. And a lot of the hard work, in my reckoning, from this pedagogical insight, is that he was brought into the world by an enormous level of hard and dedicated effort by his therapist. So stepping into the world is frontal and sagittal to get focus. And then grasping the world is the horizontal and the sagittal. And stepping into the world is the combination of all three at once. So that's one of the pedagogical, educational principles that lies behind our gradual leading of children and young people on the spectrum into the world of activity. That's part of the kind of conceptual framework. I'm not standing here saying this is proof at all. This is research still going on. Now, Dr. Koenig, who set up the Camphill movement, that was one of the foremost leading movements in the UK in the 40s, said that when you do step into the depth and relationship context and into the world of activity, you bring into relationship the ego seed of the child and the young person. You create an opportunity for its emergence. Now, what do I mean by that? What did he mean by that? In effect, at or during adolescence, when the ego is connected into the emotional life, into the practical life, and into the cognitive life, the child and the young adolescent has a better sense of being able to avoid coercion. So one of the things that we have to watch for very, very carefully in our trust are children and young people, and we heard a little bit about it today, who come under the operation of coercion from other adults. And coercion tends to actually disrupt all learning opportunities, the development of autonomy, the sense of being actualized in the world through what you do and how you present yourself. So here we are. This is actually how we do it. On the left-hand side, we got a young boy who was a neat boy. This is a term that was used in England about 5-6 years ago. Not in education and training, and he hadn't been to school for 3 years. He was wild, and I wasn't sure how we were going to catch him, because it is about catching, pulling, drawing in, and he slowly, in the next 2 months, kind of vortexed into a center, and he found the spinning wheel. Mesmerizing, and he was able to spin for hours and hours and hours. Now, if you deconstruct spinning, you realize that he's actually having to connect his cerebral element, his emotional element, and his motoric element as a thread, a kind of rethreading his life, his biography, into cohesion. And then, having done yards and yards of wool, he gave it to the weaver. In fact, he sold it to the weaver. And that motivation of being able to do something practical and valuable in the world transformed him. So in disestablishing the classroom and the college concept of learning and putting activities and kind of incentives to become relational, which means trading in your good work yourself, in your products that you make, you generate high levels of participation and engagement. So the second young man was a hyperkinetic ADHD young man, and he wanted to be a jockey and a rider, and completely impossible, you know? And there he is, under a tree, driving the pole lathe, making a British or English country ladderback chair. This is a really challenging task. And again, his kind of capacity to reveal himself only became apparent when he made this beautiful chair. You'll see some of the chairs later on. And the young man who is blowing glass. If I had more time, I could take you through a whole kind of constitutional process of what glass blowing can do to de-escalating emotion, de-escalating anxiety, de-escalating the sense of self-failure as well. And yet, they fail all the time without it actually affecting their psyche. We also do a lot of gardening. In fact, we do precision gardening. Our gardens are biodynamic, and the Discovery Centre's already described a little bit of that. And the gardening that is highly organized, highly ordered, highly productive is a refuge, again, particularly for the ADHD and the high-functioning Asperger. So we set up markets, we set up stalls, we trade it. We trade this, these are box systems at the local university, and it's sold within the first 45 minutes. In fact, we have to kind of set our stall and then it goes straight down again, because there are queues for the quality of this produce. Right, I'd like to invite Sophia to finish off and say a little bit about what we're doing in the care facility of Ruskin Mill Trust. So, Sophia, thank you.
Thank you, Aonghous. So that's really special coming up here as one of the last speakers, or even the last on a... Yeah, it's been a really, really good 3 days, and so thank you for having us here. And I've heard, lots of words and concepts that have stuck with me that are very close to my practice around seeing the bigger picture for each individual, having high expectations, developing self-determination, or maybe free will, as I would call it, and a focused or a strength-focused approach. So my background is that I worked for 12 years for Ruskin Mill Trust as a residential carer. I lived with 3 or 4 students, my own 3 children, and a husband, luckily. So we were quite a big household, and there's lots of people have already said that actually the young people were teaching me much more than I was teaching them. I would never sign off the risk assessment for this now, but having a newborn baby and people who were very outwardly reacting was the best de-escalating training I have ever done, because I couldn't afford any of that behavior, so we had to de-escalate. Anyway, my progression then went into leadership and management, which is what I've done for many years. I was the head of residential for one of our colleges, where the work consists of things like making sure that the staff are adequately trained to do what we ask them to do, telling them what they need to do, making sure the students are assessed and that their needs are all recorded in their support plans, doing quality assurance structures, which are quite formal things, and developing service improvement plans. So really overseeing the service for the residential students and making sure that their quality of life is as good as it can be in the residential homes. Our normal setup is that we have small domestic-sized households in the local communities. We don't have any accommodation in big campuses on site, because we want the young people to live in the local community so that they're experiencing this, what we would all expect to be a normal kind of daytime routine of going home and then coming into work and then going home again. So with the quality assurance, although I had all the standardized quality assurance, I also had my own kind of internal thing that went, if I go into a household and I can't tell myself that I would be happy for my child to live here, then I've got a problem. Now, I haven't got a child with autism, but I think there are things that are universal anyway for parents. Things like, are the people who are supporting my staff interested in who they are? Have they got aspirations on their behalf? Do they want to see them grow? It's difficult to use a word like love. It often kind of gets associated with all sorts of safeguarding issues. But anyway, a non-sentimental love. Do they actually want what's best for my child? And it occurred more and more often that I would go into a home and I wasn't able to answer this confidently. And that's in spite of having made sure that the staff had all the right skills, had all the right knowledge. It felt like there was something missing, which is more to do with attitude, or the performance aspect of connecting those two. And one time it really struck me was when going into a house, and we've got these lovely pictures here of meal times. And this is one of the situations where we're functionalizing what's been happening during the day. So they might have been making bread, they've been growing vegetable, they brought back the vegetable. There might be some pottery that's been made by one of them. So this is an occasion to sit down and celebrate the work that's been going on during the day. They've made something that has a function in the world, and now they're making use of it and seeing other people use it again. Oh no. Very quickly, saw that that this wasn't happening, that the young people weren't being encouraged to come to the table. And very briefly now, what we set up was a training centre where all our staff now have to come and live for 3 days. We've got one household, which is for staff training. They have to come and live residentially, and they get trained by the students. So if we're thinking back to the 3-stage process we had originally of overcoming barriers to learning, becoming skilled, and then giving back to the community, that process of the students giving back to the community in the sense of actually delivering training for the new staff has been an incredible journey for us. One young person I'm working with started with us 5 years ago. She was on 2-to-1 support when she started. She had waking night support. There was a very, very difficult risk profile. She's now, I call her my deputy, because when I can't think of staff who I can rely on, I know I can always rely on her to get done what needs to be done. And she delivers the training with me. She's made a PowerPoint presentation about what holistic support and care means to her that she delivers. She leads a craft session, and to see her stand and tell the staff, now just be patient, take it step by step, don't get worried if you're not getting it right, ask for help, which are all the things that she couldn't do when she first started 5 years ago. She's got paid employment, and I'm hoping, I haven't told Aonghous this yet, that at some point we'll be able to set up a kind of training role as well for some of the students, so that will be a paid opportunity as well. So, I'm very out of time, sorry.
Thank you, Sophia. So there is a photocopy, if you want to have, of the talk. Thank you.